Hello everyone. Tonight we explore one of the most fascinating questions in human history. How did early humans understand reproduction? Before science, before medicine, before writing. And before we go any further, think about this for a moment. How could they connect an action to a result that appears months later? And that's exactly what we're going to explore tonight. How they slowly discovered this mystery, step by step. There was a time long before writing existed, and long before the human body could be explained through diagrams or structured knowledge, a time when life was understood only through what could be seen, felt, and remembered. In that distant world, children were still being born and raised without anyone fully describing how life began or how it developed inside the body. And this creates a quiet question that grows deeper the more you think about it. How did early humans begin to understand reproduction when its beginning was invisible and its outcome delayed by long stretches of time? If you imagine yourself living in that world without modern knowledge, you begin to realize how different understanding itself must have been, because knowledge did not arrive as facts but as patterns slowly noticed over time. People learned not through explanation, but through repetition, memory, and shared experience within their communities. And this meant that understanding reproduction was not immediate, but something that slowly emerged from observation and attention across many generations. Nothing about reproduction would have appeared obvious at first, because the beginning of life unfolds quietly within the body and remains hidden for a long time before any visible changes appear. Months could pass between an intimate moment and the clear signs of pregnancy, and during that time life continued with movement, survival, and daily activity. This long delay made it difficult to connect cause and effect, forcing early humans to rely on patterns rather than certainty. Women would have been the first to hold a deeper awareness of these patterns, because their bodies moved through cycles that could be felt and observed directly over time. Through repeated experiences, they began to recognize changes and anticipate outcomes, even if they could not fully explain the process behind them. Older women carried even more knowledge through memory, guiding younger generations through pregnancy and birth, using experience rather than formal teaching. Men experienced reproduction from a different perspective, because they could not observe the internal changes and instead relied on external patterns and social outcomes. They noticed that certain relationships were often followed by the presence of children, and they observed resemblance and family structures developing over time. Through repeated observation, they began to infer connections, even if the exact mechanism remained unclear. Time itself was one of the greatest challenges in understanding reproduction, because the delay between cause and effect made patterns harder to recognize. Unlike immediate events where the result follows quickly, reproduction required patience and repeated observation across long periods. And yet, over many generations, these patterns slowly became more visible, forming the foundation of early human understanding. As these patterns continued to appear across different groups and environments, early humans began to notice that reproduction was not random, but loosely connected to certain conditions that repeated themselves over time. These connections were not always precise, but they were consistent enough to influence attention and behavior within the community. And through this slow accumulation of observation, reproduction began to shift from a complete mystery into something that could be anticipated, even if it could not yet be fully explained. Animals played an important role in shaping this awareness, because their behavior often revealed clearer sequences of mating, gestation, and birth that could be observed more directly. early humans watched herds and smaller creatures over seasons, noticing how offspring appeared after specific interactions and how care was given immediately after birth. These visible patterns did not provide exact answers, but they offered a reference point that helped humans form early comparisons with their own lives. At the same time, human reproduction remained more complex and less predictable than what was observed in animals, because it did not follow strict seasonal cycles and could occur at different times throughout the year. This irregularity made patterns harder to define, especially when combined with differences in health, environment, and individual experience. And because of this, understanding developed slowly, shaped by both observation and uncertainty rather than clear rules. Within the community, repeated exposure to pregnancy and birth gradually created familiarity with the stages that followed one another, even if the beginning remained hidden. People could recognize early signs, anticipate later changes, and prepare for the arrival of a child based on what they had seen before. This practical awareness allowed them to respond effectively, even without understanding the deeper biological processes involved. Memory became one of the most important tools in this process, because knowledge could not be written down and had to be preserved through shared experience and storytelling. Individuals who had witnessed many births carried valuable insight that could guide others, helping to create continuity across generations. And through this shared memory, patterns were reinforced and passed forward, allowing understanding to grow over time. Variation continued to shape this learning process, because not every pregnancy followed the same path, and not every outcome was predictable. Some pregnancies ended early, some progressed differently, and some resulted in complications that disrupted expected patterns. These differences made it difficult to form absolute conclusions, keeping reproduction partially uncertain even as general patterns became clearer. As uncertainty remained present, early humans began to rely more on shared interpretation to make sense of what could not be directly observed. And this is where collective thinking started to shape understanding in subtle but powerful ways. Ideas about reproduction were no longer formed only through individual observation, but through conversations, stories, and repeated explanations that gave structure to what people believed they were seeing. And over time, these shared interpretations created a sense of coherence, even when the underlying reality was still only partially understood. Rituals began to emerge as a way to give form to important moments that could not be fully explained, especially when it came to changes in the body that signaled the possibility of new life. Certain actions, gestures, or traditions may have been repeated around these moments, not because they caused the outcome, but because they created a sense of control and meaning within the community. And through repetition, these practices became embedded in daily life, reinforcing attention to reproduction without requiring full understanding of its hidden processes. Attention also shifted toward timing, as people began to notice that certain periods seemed more connected to the possibility of pregnancy than others, even if these patterns were not fully precise. These observations were shaped by cycles, by the passing of days and changes in the body, and by repeated experiences that allowed individuals to recognize when something felt different. And while this awareness remained incomplete, it still influenced behavior and expectation in subtle ways. At the same time, reproduction became more closely linked to responsibility within the group, because the arrival of a child required preparation, support, and coordination among multiple people. This meant that understanding was no longer just about recognizing patterns, but also about responding to them in ways that ensured survival. And through this process, reproduction became deeply integrated into the structure of social life, influencing roles, relationships, and daily routines. Differences between individuals continued to add complexity to this understanding, because no two experiences were exactly the same, and outcomes could vary even under similar conditions. This made it difficult to rely on simple conclusions, forcing early humans to remain flexible in how they interpreted patterns and responded to them. And this flexibility became a strength, allowing knowledge to adapt rather than remain fixed. Over generations, the combination of observation, shared interpretation, and social response created a system of understanding that was practical rather than theoretical, grounded in what people had seen and experienced rather than in abstract explanation. This system did not require complete accuracy to function, because it was constantly being refined through new experiences and adjustments. And in this ongoing process, reproduction became something that could be managed and supported, even if it was not fully understood. As this practical understanding deepened, attention began to shift toward the conditions surrounding pregnancy rather than only the events that preceded it, because people started to notice that the environment, food availability, and physical state of the mother could influence outcomes in ways that were not always predictable, but were often meaningful. These observations did not produce exact rules, but they encouraged a more careful awareness of how different factors seem to affect the development of life over time. And through this awareness, reproduction became connected not only to behavior, but also to the broader context of daily living. Care for mothers gradually became more intentional, as communities recognized that support during pregnancy and birth could influence survival, even if they could not fully explain why. Attention to rest, protection, and assistance during difficult moments became part of shared behavior, shaped by past experiences that had shown what seemed to help and what did not. And through repetition, these practices became embedded in routine, reinforcing a form of knowledge that existed through action rather than explanation. Infant care also played a crucial role in shaping understanding, because the period after birth offered visible evidence of what was required for survival, and this evidence could be observed by many people within the group. Feeding, warmth, protection, and constant attention were clearly necessary, and these needs created patterns that were easier to recognize than the hidden beginnings of life. And by understanding what happened after birth, early humans could indirectly strengthen their awareness of the entire reproductive process. As generations passed, knowledge began to stabilize through continuity rather than certainty, meaning that people did not need to fully understand reproduction in order to act effectively within it. What mattered was that patterns were remembered, responses were shared, and practices were repeated in ways that supported survival across time. And this continuity created a stable framework that allowed human life to persist, even while many aspects of reproduction remained unseen. At the same time, curiosity did not disappear, because the human tendency to question and interpret continued to shape how reproduction was understood, especially when outcomes did not match expectations. Unexpected results encouraged further observation, deeper reflection, and sometimes new interpretations that expanded or adjusted existing understanding. And in this way, knowledge remained dynamic, constantly evolving as new experiences added to what had already been learned. Over long periods, this evolving awareness began to influence how people thought about connection, inheritance, and the continuation of life, even if these ideas were not yet clearly defined in biological terms. The recognition that children were linked to those who came before them created a sense of continuity that extended beyond individual experience. And through this growing awareness, reproduction became not only a physical process but also a way of understanding time, identity, and the persistence of human life. As awareness continued to expand, early humans began to notice that reproduction was connected to sequences that extended beyond a single event, because what happened before, during, and after pregnancy seemed to form a continuous chain that could be observed across different individuals and different moments in time. These sequences were not always identical, but they shared enough similarities to create a sense that reproduction followed a process rather than occurring in isolation. And through repeated exposure to these sequences, people became more attentive to transitions, recognizing that each stage carried its own signs and required its own response. Attention also shifted toward the relationship between individuals, because patterns in reproduction appeared to be influenced not only by physical conditions, but also by social connections that remained consistent over time. Certain bonds seemed more closely associated with the presence of children, and this created a growing awareness that relationships themselves played a role in shaping outcomes. And while the underlying mechanism remained unseen, the consistency of these patterns reinforced the idea that reproduction was tied to both interaction and continuity. The role of proximity became more noticeable as well, because living closely within a group allowed repeated observation of changes that might otherwise go unnoticed in more isolated conditions. People could see how bodies changed over time, how behavior shifted, and how outcomes followed certain interactions, creating a dense network of observations that strengthened understanding. And this constant exposure made it easier to recognize patterns, even when those patterns were separated by long intervals. As knowledge accumulated, early humans also began to distinguish between what appeared to be necessary and what appeared to be coincidental, even if they could not always draw clear boundaries between the two. Some patterns seemed reliable enough to guide behavior, while others remained uncertain and were treated with caution or interpreted through symbolic meaning. And this distinction, even when imperfect, allowed people to prioritize certain observations over others, gradually refining their understanding. Learning continued to depend on experience rather than formal instruction, because knowledge was still transmitted through participation, observation, and shared activity within the group. Individuals learned by being present during key moments, by assisting, by watching others respond, and by remembering what followed. And through this process, understanding was reinforced not by explanation, but by repeated exposure to the same patterns over time. Over generations, these layers of observation, interpretation, and response created a complex but functional system of knowledge that allowed early humans to navigate reproduction with increasing confidence. This system did not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced confusion by providing enough consistency to support decision-making and care. And in this gradual movement from uncertainty toward recognition, reproduction became more integrated into human awareness as something that could be anticipated, supported, and understood in practical terms. Early humans began to notice that reproduction was not only connected to individual actions or relationships, but also to broader rhythms that seemed to move through the group over time, creating patterns that extended beyond single experiences and into the shared life of the community. These rhythms were not always predictable, but they appeared often enough to draw attention, encouraging people to observe not just isolated events, but recurring cycles that unfolded across many lives. And through this wider perspective, reproduction began to feel less like a random occurrence, and more like part of a larger pattern that could be followed and recognized. The passage of time itself became a tool for understanding, because repeated exposure to similar sequences allowed individuals to compare what they were seeing now with what they had seen before, even if those memories were not perfectly clear or complete. This comparison created a sense of continuity, linking past experiences with present observations in a way that gradually strengthened recognition. And through this process, knowledge became layered, built not from a single moment of insight, but from many moments of partial understanding that accumulated over time. At the same time, attention to subtle differences became increasingly important, because not every pattern unfolded in exactly the same way, and small variations could influence outcomes in significant ways. Early humans learned to notice these differences, not by analyzing them in abstract terms, but by observing how changes in behavior, timing, or condition seemed to alter what followed. And this sensitivity to variation allowed understanding to become more flexible, adapting to new situations rather than relying on fixed expectations. As communities continued to observe and respond to these patterns, reproduction became more deeply integrated into collective awareness, shaping not only behavior, but also the way people interpreted their experiences. Events that once seemed disconnected began to feel linked, forming a chain of meaning that extended across time and across individuals. And through this growing sense of connection, reproduction became something that could be anticipated and prepared for, even when its hidden beginnings remained out of sight. Memory continued to play a central role, because the ability to recall previous experiences allowed individuals to recognize patterns that might otherwise go unnoticed in the flow of daily life. Those who had witnessed many cycles carried a deeper sense of familiarity, which they could share through guidance, action, and example, rather than through formal teaching. And in this way, memory acted as a bridge between generations, preserving knowledge even in the absence of written records. Over long periods, the combination of observation, comparison, and shared memory created a form of understanding that was both practical and adaptable, capable of guiding behavior without requiring complete certainty. This understanding was never fixed, but constantly shaped by new experiences and changing conditions, allowing it to remain relevant across different contexts. And through this ongoing process, reproduction became part of a broader system of knowledge that connected individuals, communities, and time itself. As this growing awareness settled into daily life, early humans began to pay closer attention to sequences that repeated not only within individuals but across entire generations, because seeing the same patterns unfold in different people over long periods made those patterns feel more stable and meaningful. These repeated sequences created a quiet sense that reproduction followed an order, even if that order could not be fully described or measured. And through this long-term observation, understanding gained depth, becoming less dependent on single experiences and more rooted in collective memory. The role of expectation also began to emerge, because once patterns were recognized, people started to anticipate what might happen next, based on what had happened before, even if they were not always correct. This anticipation influenced behavior, shaping how individuals prepared for change and responded to early signs that suggested something new was developing. And while expectation did not guarantee accuracy, it created a framework that made reproduction feel less uncertain and more connected to previous experience. Attention to the body became more refined as well, not in a scientific sense, but in a practical and observational way that focused on visible and felt changes over time. Subtle differences in movement, appearance, and behavior were noticed more carefully, especially when they had been associated with important outcomes in the past. And through this careful attention, the body itself became a source of information, offering signals that could guide action even when their deeper meaning remained unclear. Social interaction continued to reinforce this understanding because individuals rarely experienced reproduction in isolation, and most events were observed by others within the group. This shared observation allowed patterns to be confirmed or questioned through collective experience, strengthening those that appeared consistently and reshaping those that did not. And through this process, knowledge became distributed across the community rather than held by any single individual. At the same time, uncertainty remained a constant presence because no pattern was ever perfectly reliable, and unexpected outcomes could still occur even when conditions seemed similar. These moments of unpredictability reminded early humans that their understanding was incomplete, encouraging continued observation rather than fixed conclusions. And in this balance between expectation and uncertainty, knowledge remained open to change, capable of adapting as new experiences emerged. Over generations, this combination of observation, expectation, and shared experience created a deeper sense of continuity, linking individuals to those who came before them through repeated patterns of life. Reproduction became one of the clearest expressions of this continuity, connecting past, present, and future through a process that was both familiar and mysterious. And through this ongoing connection, early humans developed a way of understanding that allowed them to navigate reproduction with increasing confidence, even without full explanation. As this sense of continuity became stronger, early humans began to recognize that reproduction was not only something that happened repeatedly, but something that linked individuals across time in a way that gave meaning to both past and future. This recognition did not come from theory, but from the simple and repeated observation that life continued through recognizable lines of connection that could be seen within families and groups. And through this awareness, reproduction became more than an event. It became a bridge that connected generations through shared existence. The idea of resemblance also gained importance, because people began to notice that children often carried visible traits that reflected others within the group, even if they could not fully explain how or why this happened. These similarities created a stronger sense of connection, reinforcing the belief that reproduction was not random, but structured in a way that preserved certain features over time. And through repeated observation of these patterns, early humans began to associate identity itself with continuity across generations. At the same time, attention to timing became more refined, as individuals noticed that certain moments or conditions seemed more closely associated with the beginning of change, even if they could not define these moments precisely. This awareness did not produce exact predictions, but it allowed people to develop a general sense of when outcomes were more likely to occur. And through this gradual refinement, timing became part of practical understanding, shaping expectations and behavior within the group. The environment also played a role in shaping perception, because early humans lived closely with natural changes that influenced all aspects of life, including reproduction. Shifts in weather, availability of food, and overall conditions seemed to affect outcomes in ways that were not always clear, but were often noticeable. And through this connection, reproduction became linked not only to human behavior, but also to the broader rhythms of the world around them. Shared experience continued to strengthen understanding, because individuals did not rely only on their own observations, but also on what others had seen and remembered over time. This collective memory allowed patterns to be recognized more clearly, as multiple perspectives reinforced similar conclusions. And through this process, knowledge became more stable. even without formal systems of explanation or recording. Over time, reproduction became integrated into a wider sense of how life unfolds, connecting individual experience with group awareness and environmental context in a way that created a coherent, though incomplete, understanding. This understanding was not fixed, but constantly shaped by new observations and changing conditions, allowing it to remain flexible and responsive. And through this evolving awareness, early humans continued to deepen their connection to the processes that sustained life across generations. As this broader awareness continued to expand, early humans began to notice that reproduction was not only something that connected individuals, but also something that shaped the structure of their entire community over time. The presence of children influenced movement, decisions, and the way groups organized themselves, creating patterns that extended far beyond the moment of birth. And through this connection, reproduction became tied to survival in a deeper way, influencing how people lived together and supported one another. The idea of responsibility gradually became more defined, not through formal rules, but through repeated experience that showed how care and attention affected outcomes. People learned that certain actions after birth were necessary for survival, and this created a growing awareness that reproduction required ongoing involvement rather than ending at the moment a child was born. And through this realization, understanding expanded from recognizing patterns to actively responding to them in ways that supported life. Attention also shifted toward the early stages of change, as individuals became more sensitive to subtle signs that indicated something was developing, even before those signs became obvious. These early indicators were not always clear, but they were often noticed by those who had seen similar changes before, especially within shared living environments where observation was constant. And through this sensitivity, anticipation became more refined, allowing people to prepare earlier for what might follow. Differences between individuals continued to influence understanding, because each experience added new variations that either reinforced or challenged existing patterns. Some outcomes confirmed what had been observed before, while others introduced uncertainty that required reinterpretation. And through this continuous process of adjustment, knowledge remained flexible, shaped by both confirmation and change rather than fixed certainty. As communities grew and remained together for longer periods, the ability to observe multiple generations at once strengthened the recognition of long-term patterns. People could see how children developed into adults, and how those adults became part of the same cycle they had once been born into. And this extended perspective allowed reproduction to be understood not just as an event, but as a repeating process that defined the continuity of human life. Over time, the combination of observation, responsibility, anticipation, and adaptation created a deeper level of awareness that allowed early humans to navigate reproduction with increasing confidence. This awareness did not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced confusion by providing enough consistency to guide action. And through this gradual refinement, reproduction became a central part of human understanding, connected to both survival and the ongoing story of the group. As this understanding continued to mature, early humans began to recognize that reproduction was deeply connected to the continuity of identity within the group, because each new child represented not only survival, but also the extension of something familiar into the future. This recognition was not expressed in abstract ideas, but in the simple awareness that life continued through repeating forms and shared characteristics. And through this connection, reproduction became part of how people understood themselves within the flow of time. the concept of lineage slowly began to take shape through observation rather than definition, as people noticed that certain traits, behaviors, or appearances seemed to persist across generations in ways that were too consistent to ignore. These patterns strengthened the perception that individuals were not isolated, but linked through a chain that extended both backward and forward. And through this awareness, reproduction became a way of understanding continuity beyond a single lifetime. At the same time, attention to partnership and social bonds became more meaningful, because repeated patterns suggested that certain connections between individuals were more likely to be followed by the presence of children. These associations did not need to be fully understood to influence behavior, as their consistency alone was enough to guide expectation. And through this repeated observation, relationships became more closely tied to reproductive outcomes in the minds of early humans. Environmental stability also began to play a stronger role in perception, as groups that remained in one place for longer periods were able to observe patterns with greater consistency and less interruption. This stability allowed for clearer comparisons across time, making it easier to recognize recurring sequences and outcomes. And through this increased clarity, understanding became more grounded in repeated observation, rather than fragmented experience. Social roles continued to evolve alongside this awareness, as individuals adapted their behavior based on what they had learned about reproduction and its consequences. Responsibilities became more structured through repetition, even without formal rules, as people responded to patterns that had proven important for survival. And through this process, reproduction became more deeply embedded in the organization of daily life. Over generations, these developments created a more stable and interconnected understanding of reproduction, linking identity, relationships, environment, and social structure into a single framework shaped by observation and experience. This framework was not complete or fully accurate, but it was functional and adaptable, allowing early humans to respond effectively to the challenges of reproduction. And through this evolving system, knowledge continued to grow, shaped by time and reinforced by continuity. Early humans began to sense that reproduction was not simply a sequence of events, but a process that unfolded across different stages, each with its own visible signs and implications. These stages were not defined with precision, but they were recognized through repeated exposure, allowing individuals to distinguish between early changes, later developments, and the moment of birth itself. And through this layered perception, understanding became more structured, even without formal language to describe it. The importance of observation became more deliberate over time, as individuals who had witnessed multiple cycles began to pay closer attention to details that might have once gone unnoticed. Small differences in timing, behavior, or physical condition became meaningful, especially when they were associated with outcomes that had been seen before. And through this increasing attention to detail, patterns became clearer, strengthening the ability to anticipate and respond. Communication also played a subtle but important role, not through formal explanation, but through shared activity and collective awareness that allowed knowledge to circulate within the group. People learned by being present during significant moments, by observing how others responded, and by participating in actions that reflected accumulated experience. And through this process, understanding was reinforced without the need for structured teaching. At the same time, unpredictability remained an essential part of the experience, because not every sequence followed the same path, and unexpected outcomes continued to occur even when conditions seemed familiar. These variations prevented understanding from becoming rigid, encouraging continuous observation and adaptation rather than fixed conclusions. And through this balance, knowledge remained responsive to change rather than confined to past experience. As generations passed, the accumulation of these observations created a deeper sense of familiarity with reproduction, transforming it from something uncertain into something that could be recognized with increasing confidence. This familiarity did not remove all mystery, but it reduced confusion by providing a framework that made patterns easier to interpret. And through this gradual shift, reproduction became more integrated into human awareness as a process that could be followed, even if not fully explained. Over time, this evolving understanding began to influence how people perceived the continuity of life itself, as reproduction became one of the most consistent patterns linking individuals across time. The repeated presence of this process reinforced the idea that life followed a rhythm that extended beyond any single moment or experience. And through this awareness, early humans developed a deeper connection to the cycles that sustained their existence. Early humans began to notice that reproduction was not only connected to patterns in the body or the environment, but also influenced by relationships between individuals in ways that were not always predictable or easy to interpret. These observations gradually drew attention to differences in how connections formed and how outcomes followed, creating a subtle awareness that not all interactions carried the same implications over time. And through this awareness, reproduction became more closely tied to the complexity of human relationships, rather than remaining a simple sequence of events. This growing awareness also introduced a sense of uncertainty, especially when patterns did not align as expected, leading individuals to question outcomes that seemed inconsistent with previous observations. In situations where timing, resemblance, or relationships did not clearly match what had been seen before, doubt could emerge without a clear way to resolve it. And within this uncertainty, new interpretations began to form, shaped not only by observation, but also by emotion and social perception. Attention to resemblance became more intense in this context, as people looked for visible signs that could confirm connections between individuals across generations. Similarities in appearance or behavior were given increasing importance, not because they were fully understood, but because they offered one of the few observable links between cause and outcome. And through repeated comparison, these signs began to influence how relationships were perceived and understood within the group. At the same time, emotional responses began to play a more noticeable role in shaping interpretation, because uncertainty in outcomes could lead to feelings that influenced how patterns were understood and remembered. These responses were not separate from observation, but intertwined with it, affecting how individuals interpreted what they saw and how they responded to it. And through this interaction, understanding became not only a matter of pattern recognition, but also of social and emotional experience. As these dynamics developed, early humans began to form informal expectations about relationships and outcomes, even if those expectations were not always accurate or consistent. Certain patterns were treated as more reliable than others, shaping behavior in ways that reflected both observation and belief. And through this process, reproduction became increasingly embedded in the social fabric, influenced by perception as much as by reality. Over time, the combination of observation, uncertainty, resemblance, and emotional response created a more complex layer of understanding that extended beyond simple pattern recognition. This layer did not replace earlier knowledge, but added depth to it, reflecting the evolving nature of human awareness as it adapted to new experiences. And through this gradual expansion, reproduction became connected not only to survival and continuity, but also to the developing structure of human relationships. As these social tensions quietly grew, early humans began to pay closer attention to consistency in relationships, not as a formal rule, but as a way to reduce uncertainty and make outcomes feel more predictable over time. Patterns that appeared stable were observed more carefully, and individuals started to rely on repeated association between certain bonds and the presence of children. And through this subtle shift in attention, reproduction became more closely linked to continuity in relationships rather than isolated interactions. This did not create certainty, but it created preference, as some patterns felt more reliable than others, even when they could not be fully explained or guaranteed. People began to favor what seemed consistent, not because they understood the mechanism, but because repeated outcomes suggested a connection that could be trusted more than randomness. And through this gradual process, behavior began to adapt in ways that reflected both observation and the desire for clarity. At the same time, social awareness expanded to include not only who formed connections, but how those connections were recognized within the group itself. The presence of shared acknowledgement, repeated interaction, and visible association became important factors in how relationships were perceived over time, and through this collective observation, understanding was shaped not only by individual experience, but by how the group interpreted patterns together. This collective interpretation created a form of agreement, not spoken or written, but expressed through behavior and expectation that developed across repeated experiences. Certain associations came to be treated as more meaningful, not because they were proven, but because they were observed often enough to influence how people acted and responded. And through this shared understanding, reproduction became further embedded within the structure of social life. Differences in outcomes continued to challenge these patterns, as variation remained present and not every situation followed what had been observed before. These differences required constant adjustment, preventing understanding from becoming fixed or absolute. And through this ongoing process of refinement, knowledge remained flexible, shaped by both repetition and exception, rather than certainty alone. Over time, the interaction between observation, preference, and collective interpretation created a more stable framework for understanding reproduction within the group. This framework did not eliminate uncertainty, but it reduced confusion by providing patterns that could guide behavior more consistently. And through this evolving structure, reproduction became not only a biological process, but a central part of how early humans organized relationships and made sense of their social world. As these emerging patterns continued to shape behavior, early humans began to rely more on continuity within relationships as a way to stabilize their expectations. Because repeated association over time made certain outcomes feel less uncertain, even without full understanding. This did not create exact knowledge, but it provided a sense of direction, allowing individuals to navigate reproduction with greater confidence than before. And through this reliance on continuity, patterns became more firmly connected to behavior, influencing decisions in subtle but lasting ways. At the same time, the need to reduce uncertainty encouraged the development of shared expectations that extended beyond individual perception and became part of how the group collectively interpreted relationships and outcomes. These expectations were not fixed rules, but they guided attention and shaped responses, reinforcing patterns that appeared consistent across different situations. And through this shared awareness, reproduction became increasingly tied to social agreement as much as to observation. Attention to sequence also became more refined, as individuals began to notice not only that certain outcomes followed certain interactions, but that they did so in ways that formed recognizable orders over time. This awareness of sequence strengthened the perception that reproduction followed a process with stages, even if those stages were not fully understood. And through repeated observation, this sense of order became an important part of how early humans interpreted change. Variation, however, continued to challenge these developing patterns, ensuring that understanding remained incomplete and open to revision as new experiences emerged. Unexpected outcomes required reinterpretation, forcing individuals to reconsider what they believed they had learned and to adjust their expectations accordingly. And through this constant adjustment, knowledge remained dynamic rather than fixed. As communities observed these patterns across longer periods, reproduction became more deeply integrated into the way people understood connection, responsibility, and continuity within the group. It was no longer simply an outcome to be noticed, but a process that influenced how individuals related to one another and how they perceived their place within the community. And through this integration, reproduction became a central thread linking observation, behavior, and social structure. Over time, the combination of continuity, shared expectation, refined observation, and adaptation created a more cohesive understanding that allowed early humans to act with increasing consistency. This understanding was still incomplete, but it was functional and resilient, capable of guiding behavior across changing conditions. And through this gradual development, reproduction became not only something that was observed, but something that was increasingly understood within the limits of human experience. Early humans began to notice that stability in living conditions allowed patterns to become clearer over time, because remaining in one place reduced the interruptions that once made observation more fragmented and uncertain. This stability made it easier to compare experiences across longer periods, allowing individuals to recognize sequences that repeated with greater consistency. And through this shift, understanding became more grounded in sustained observation rather than scattered memory. With this increased stability, attention began to extend beyond individual experiences and toward the structure of households, where relationships, births, and care could be observed in a more continuous and organized way. People could now see how patterns unfolded within the same group over many cycles, reinforcing connections that had once seemed uncertain. And through this repeated exposure, reproduction became more closely linked to the ongoing life of the household rather than isolated moments of change. The presence of multiple generations living together also strengthened this awareness, because individuals could observe not only immediate outcomes but long-term development across time. Seeing how children grew and eventually became part of the same process they were once born into created a deeper understanding of continuity. And through this extended perspective, reproduction became connected to a broader sense of time that linked past experience with future expectation. At the same time, shared responsibility within these more stable communities reinforced attention to reproduction, as the care of children required coordination and cooperation among many individuals. This collective involvement created more opportunities for observation and learning, allowing knowledge to circulate more effectively within the group. And through this process, understanding became more widely distributed rather than limited to individual experience. Differences between households and environments continued to influence outcomes, reminding early humans that patterns were shaped by conditions as well as behavior. This awareness encouraged a more flexible approach to understanding, as individuals adjusted their expectations based on what they observed in different contexts. And through this adaptability, knowledge remained responsive to variation rather than fixed in a single interpretation. Over time, the combination of stability, shared observation, and extended perspective allowed early humans to refine their understanding of reproduction in ways that were not possible in more mobile conditions. This refinement did not eliminate uncertainty, but it strengthened recognition and improved the ability to anticipate and respond. And through this gradual development, reproduction became more clearly integrated into the structure of settled life and collective experience. As these more stable patterns continued to take shape, early humans began to notice that repetition within the same environment created a stronger sense of predictability, because similar conditions often led to similar outcomes over time. This predictability did not remove all uncertainty, but it allowed individuals to develop expectations that were more consistent than before, and through this gradual reinforcement, understanding became less fragmented and more connected to ongoing experience. The organization of daily life also began to reflect this growing awareness, as routines and roles adjusted in response to what had been observed about reproduction and its consequences. Activities related to care, preparation, and support became more structured through repetition, even without formal planning or instruction. And through these repeated behaviors, knowledge was reinforced in practical ways that shaped how people acted within their environment. Attention to long-term outcomes became more pronounced, as individuals could now observe not only the beginning and middle stages of reproduction, but also its results over extended periods. This allowed for a deeper recognition of how early conditions influenced later development, creating a more complete picture of the process as a whole. And through this extended observation, understanding became more continuous rather than limited to isolated moments. At the same time, comparison between different groups or situations began to influence perception, as variations in outcome highlighted the role of environment, behavior, and timing in shaping results. These comparisons encouraged individuals to consider multiple possibilities rather than relying on a single pattern. And through this broader perspective, knowledge became more adaptable and responsive to change. Social expectations continued to evolve alongside these observations, as repeated patterns influenced how people understood responsibility, connection, and continuity within the group. These expectations were not fixed rules, but they guided behavior in ways that reflected accumulated experience. And through this alignment between observation and action, reproduction became more deeply integrated into the structure of social life. Over time, the interaction between stability, repetition, comparison, and social organization created a more refined understanding that allowed early humans to navigate reproduction with greater confidence. This understanding remained incomplete, but it was increasingly reliable in guiding behavior across different situations. And through this ongoing process, reproduction became part of a larger system of knowledge shaped by experience and reinforced through daily life. As human communities continued to remain in one place for longer periods, something subtle but powerful began to change in the way patterns were perceived, because repetition no longer disappeared into movement and distance, but stayed visible within the same environment across extended stretches of time. This continuity allowed people to observe not just isolated events, but sequences that unfolded within the same group again and again, making connections feel stronger and more reliable than before. And through this stability, reproduction became easier to track, not because it was fully understood, but because it was seen more clearly within the flow of everyday life. The idea of parentage gradually became more defined through these repeated observations, as people began to associate children more consistently with specific individuals based on proximity, timing, and visible connection within the household. This did not create perfect certainty, but it created a stronger sense of linkage that influenced how relationships were interpreted and remembered over time. And through this growing awareness, reproduction became tied more closely to identity, inheritance, and the continuation of the group. At the same time, social structures adapted to support this emerging clarity, as expectations around relationships, care, and responsibility became more consistent through repetition and shared experience. These expectations were not formal laws, but they shaped behavior in ways that reflected accumulated observation, reinforcing patterns that seemed reliable. And through this process, reproduction became not only a biological and social event, but also something that influenced how communities organized themselves across generations. The presence of stored resources, cultivated land, and shared spaces further intensified attention to reproduction, because outcomes now had long-term implications for labor, continuity, and stability within the group. People began to observe how the presence of children affected the future of the household, making reproductive patterns more relevant to survival beyond immediate needs. And through this connection, reproduction became part of a larger system that linked individual lives to the ongoing structure of the community. Observation also became more cumulative, as experiences from previous generations remained visible within the same place, allowing knowledge to build more effectively over time. People could see how patterns repeated across years and across different individuals, strengthening recognition and reducing uncertainty. And through this accumulation, understanding became more stable, even if it remained incomplete. As writing eventually began to appear in some human societies, knowledge that had once depended entirely on memory and shared experience started to take on a new form, allowing observations to be preserved beyond the limits of individual recall. This did not immediately create full understanding, but it allowed patterns, beliefs, and practices to be recorded and revisited, strengthening continuity across generations. And through this shift, reproduction became something that could be described, interpreted, and discussed in ways that extended beyond direct experience. Even with this development, explanation remained incomplete, as early records often combined practical observation with symbolic meaning, reflecting both what people had seen and what they believed about unseen processes. Some ideas moved closer to accurate understanding, while others remained shaped by imagination and tradition, creating a layered view that blended reality with interpretation. And through this mixture, knowledge continued to evolve rather than becoming fixed. Over time, the accumulation of observation, social structure, and recorded knowledge created a more detailed picture of reproduction, gradually revealing connections that had once been hidden or uncertain. This process did not happen suddenly, but through many generations of attention, correction, and refinement that slowly brought greater clarity. And through this long development, reproduction moved from being a distant mystery to something that could be increasingly understood within a broader system of knowledge. Yet even with greater understanding, the origin of life retained a sense of depth that could not be reduced to simple explanation, because it remained tied to experience, connection, and continuity in ways that extended beyond observation alone. The process that once seemed invisible and uncertain had become clearer, but it still carried the weight of something deeply human and shared across time. And through this journey from observation to understanding, early humans left behind a foundation built not on sudden discovery, but on patience, attention, and the quiet persistence of learning across generations. When you step back from this long and quiet journey, what becomes clear is not just how humans came to understand reproduction, but how understanding itself was formed slowly through attention, patience, and repeated experience across countless lives. It did not begin with answers, and it did not arrive all at once, but instead grew piece by piece through observation, memory, and the shared effort of entire communities trying to make sense of what they could not fully see. And in that gradual unfolding, knowledge became something lived before it was ever explained. What once seemed hidden and distant slowly became familiar, not because the mystery disappeared, but because humans learned how to live alongside it, responding to patterns even when they did not fully understand them. The connection between closeness, time, and the arrival of life became clearer through repetition, until it was no longer something entirely unknown, but something quietly expected within the rhythm of existence. And through this expectation, reproduction became part of how humans understood continuity itself. Across generations, mothers, fathers, and entire communities contributed to this understanding in different ways, each perspective adding another layer to what was known and remembered. No single person held the full picture, but together they created a system of knowledge that was strong enough to support life and guide behavior across changing conditions. And through this shared effort, the invisible process at the beginning of life became something that could be recognized even before it was fully explained. In the end, the story of reproduction is not only about biology, but about how humans learn, adapt, and find meaning in what they observe over time. It is a story shaped by uncertainty, refined by experience, and carried forward through connection and memory rather than immediate understanding. And as you sit with that thought, wherever you are, you may begin to sense that what feels obvious today was once a quiet and distant mystery, slowly revealed through the simplest human act of paying attention.